Hello, and welcome again to the Dorothy L. Sayers podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay Scholl, and today we have a special treat, an interview with Dr. Janice Brown, the author of 7 Deadly Sins and the work of Dorothy L. Sayers. Just a quick note, this is a phone interview, so the audio will sound a little different, but I don't think that will cause any problems. Also, we had a delightfully long conversation, so I've divided the interview into 2 different segments. Stay tuned for part 2 in the next week or so. But for now, let's go ahead and give a big hello to Dr. Brown. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you.
Good. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I want to tell the audience a little bit about you and your book very briefly, and then I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit. So Dr. Janice Brown, is a Sayers scholar and a retired English professor from Grove City College. She lives in Pennsylvania, although she's originally Canadian. Her work, 7 Deadly Sins and the work of Dorothy L. Sayers, was published by Kent State University Press, and it was a finalist for the Edgar Allan Poe Award in 1998. Then in 2018, she published The Lion in the Wasteland, Fearsome Redemption and the work of C.S. Lewis, Dorothy L. Sayers, and T.S. Eliot, also by Kent State. Today we're going to be focusing on the 7 Deadly Sins. And as an aside, Dr. Brown, I just want to tell you that I think the book is so readable and scholarly. So that's the combination of those is pretty hard to find. And
thank you.
Yeah, I just really, it was just a good, informative and insightful read. So thanks for that.
Thank you.
So can you tell us how you came to know about Sayers, and then you can continue that into your interest in the 7 Deadly Sins?
Well, yes, I was a little late coming to Sayers late in my life, in that I didn't start reading her till the early 80s, I guess around 83. And it was as a result of hearing friends recommend her mysteries. Mm-hmm. At the time we were living in Papua New Guinea, I was teaching high school students at a school for missionary children run by Wycliffe Bible translators. And my husband was with me as well. He was also a teacher, and our children. But while there, I didn't have access to a good library, but some friends had the Dorothy Sayers novels, and I began reading them. In the meantime, I had also been hearing her name come up in other contexts, and that was quotations from her Christian works. I would see those quoted by other writers, by Christianity Today. And so I started getting interested in her work in both senses, both the novels and the non-fiction. So then around that same time, after we returned to Canada, I began thinking about starting a PhD in English at the university there in St. John's, Newfoundland, where I'm from, where I had done my undergraduate work and my master's. And I was thinking of a possible topic for a dissertation, and wanted something that had more breadth than what I had done previously for my master's thesis. And so I began to think, since Sayers has both fiction and nonfiction, she's both a popular writer and a deeply Christian one, perhaps I should do a dissertation on her. As I look back now, I try to remember, I don't think I had read a lot of her nonfiction at that point in time. But I just sort of grabbed onto it as an idea because I felt that she was a writer with breadth. Well, it certainly was.
Yes, well said.
And I used to feel while I was working on the dissertation that, if this never leads to a graduate degree, I am enjoying this so much. Mm-hmm. So it was a wonderful thing. I worked on it from about 87 to 1994 was when I finished. So it was over a 7-year period, which as I look back now, I wonder how I did it as quickly, because I was teaching at the same time and I had to do coursework and everything. But it was a steady challenge, and I enjoyed it.
So we had talked earlier, and I forgot to ask you, what was your master's on?
Oh, my master's was on a 17th century poet, Thomas Traherne, one of the Metaphysicals. His writing was a narrow range. And I think I chose it because I felt like it wouldn't be that difficult to read everything that he wrote and everything that was written on him. And I felt like I wanted to do something that I could feel like I covered all the material, in a fairly short space of time. And I think it was too narrow a topic. And maybe I didn't have enough at that age, although I was, well into my 30s, but I didn't have maybe the ability to see more depth. But I was successful in writing it, but I didn't enjoy it because I felt like I was banging my head against the walls of the topic.
Okay.
And so that was why I felt I am not doing that again. When I choose a dissertation for a PhD, I want something that is broad enough to be really interesting, and Sayers was certainly that.
Well, yes, you definitely, I think you picked, I'm not going to say, I don't know enough about 20th century to say the most broad author or anything like that, but she definitely has the breadth that you were looking for. Can you tell me, so that you started your dissertation, you're researching Sayers and her nonfiction and all of that. What kind of steered your research into the 7 deadly sins?
Well, I was interested in medieval things somewhat. I had done some medieval courses on the graduate level, but I also was thinking I wanted a theme that could be followed throughout the more secular work and the Christian work. And I thought possibly the theme of pride would be one to follow, because I was recognizing a lot of emphasis on the problem of pride in her fiction and in her nonfiction. And as I mentioned this to one of my professors who was a medievalist, he suggested, well, why not choose the topic of the 7 deadly sins? A topic I would never have thought of on my own because I wasn't that familiar with it. But then as I began to work on it, I found it was really interesting and was very applicable to Sayers.
Yes. Okay. Well, that makes a ton of sense. And it also kind of it speaks to Sayers' works and also her kind of latent medievalism herself that she had. So I think probably, since I'm going to title this podcast The 7 Deadly Sins, an interview with Janice Brown, we should probably give the readers who aren't so familiar with the 7 deadly sins an intro into what those are. So I'd love for you to do it if you'd like to, if you're ready for that, or I'm happy to.
Yes,
go for it.
I can do that. So they are not outward sins, they're inward. They're conditions of the heart which lead to sinful actions. And it's a concept that's not technically biblical, but it is very compatible with biblical teaching on the nature of sin and the inward nature of sinfulness. So it began actually in the very early periods before medieval times, in the early centuries of the church, in the 4th and 5th century, and was important in the monastic communities. They used it as a way of examining their lives, and they were, even though modern Christians tend to look down a little on the monastic life and think of it as very narrowing and very unproductive, it actually is a mistake to think of the monastic communities of the early church and of the Middle Ages that way. They really contributed a huge amount to the world, not just in a spiritual sense, but in a cultural sense. But they used that concept quite early as a way of examining their own hearts and developing spirituality. They were really pioneers in the realm of spirituality. And then it moved into popular culture in the Middle Ages and became a very gripping concept once it was popularized, and there was a fondness for the number 7. I spent quite a bit of time in my book talking about that. It was interesting. Many things were forced into 7s, even if there weren't 7 of them. But this, just to quote the last sentence in one of my early chapters of my book, it kind of sums up what it amounted to quite well. Centuries ago, devout men organized what the scriptures taught and what had been observed about sinful tendencies which resulted in wrong attitudes and behavior. They decided to describe these basic sinful tendencies under 7 headings. And the result was one of the most tenacious of religious concepts, the 7 deadly sins. And they're also known as the cardinal sins, probably more theologically, in theological circles, they were often known as the cardinal sins. So the order is important. I'll say a bit about that later. But the sins are usually given in this order now, although originally they were sometimes grouped as 8 rather than 7, and the order was slightly different. But now the order that was sort of formalized by the middle of the medieval period was this order: pride, anger, envy, sloth, avarice, gluttony, lust. And
can you repeat that order again for anybody who's taking notes here? Because as you said, the order is important. Let's go ahead and list them again.
Okay. Pride, anger, envy, sloth, avarice, which is also covetousness, avarice, gluttony, lust.
Beautiful.
So that way of looking at the fallen nature has a lot of implications for later work. And as many of your listeners may know, it was the shape that Dante used for his second work of the Divine Comedy, Purgatorio, as the 7 levels of the mountain upon which each person must travel. And really, I don't think we need to think of Purgatorio as something that happens in the afterlife. Dante's application, most valuable application, I think, is to think of that as the process of sanctification being described as it happens in this life. And so the 7 sins are purged on each successive level of the mountain, and the opposite virtue is developed. And so each person, the way Dante would look at it, and why Sayers, as you know, in later life was very steeped in Dante, each person has within them that root of sinfulness of all 7, although we all have different besetting sins, as the old expression was. And it's a way of looking at human nature, a way of looking at the fallen nature of every style and shape.
They're fundamental sins, right? That the capital. You said what was the word you used? What was a good word? Deadly sins, but also cardinal sins. And I'd heard capital sins as well. And either they're fundamental and they lead to other sins. There's a sin of murder, but that's got its seat in wrath.
That's an outward action. There has to be a motive. The motive that causes murder could be one or more of those sins. Right.
So keep going. This is good stuff. You're talking about the order that purgatory is. It's an allegory for this life, how to, sanctification here and now.
Yes. And so in thinking about the 7 deadly sins, it was also interesting and uplifting to realize that they represent the tension between good and evil, so that to decrease in pride is to increase in humility. To decrease in covetousness is to increase in liberality or generosity. To decrease in sloth is to increase in zeal. And so there's the converse and the interplay between the fallen nature, the natural man, the original sin that's within us, even as Christians, and the work of the Holy Spirit in our lives that's seeking to encourage us to grow in these Christ-like qualities, which are the virtues that are the opposite virtue of each of the sins.
And you can see this, it's so funny with Sayers. She has this great example, which is a great illustration of when she first started really reading Dante. She was in a bomb shelter and just kind of eating them up, and just, she said, doodle bugs were falling all over her neighborhood, and she didn't even pay attention, which were the bombs. But you just see so much of Dante's this way of thinking so early in her work.
Yes.
Also,
yes.
As you're going to point out in your book and we'll get to the novels here in a second, but how some of the characters represent the converse of the vice. So you have Miss Venables and other characters who. Yes. It's not just sins that are represented in her work; it's the virtues.
Yes.
As well. Wow, that's a much better introduction to the 7 deadly sins than what I would have given. So thank you for that. Is there anything else our readers or listeners need to hear about the 7 deadly sins before we kind of go into the Sayers aspect of things?
No, I think that it's probably a little bit misleading that they're called deadly because it makes them sound a little bit more showy and spectacular. But I think they're just deadly in the sense that they deaden the soul and they lead to eternal death. I don't think they're being labeled deadly is necessarily helpful to our understanding what they are. So I think maybe thinking of them as the cardinal sins or the root sins is a little more accurate to what our understanding of them should be.
Because there's also, and I wasn't raised in the Catholic tradition, I'm not a Catholic, but there's also like venial sins and mortal sins. And I don't know how those actually interact with the deadly sins, or if they do.
I'm not sure that they do. Sayre sometimes makes the distinction between warm-hearted and cold-hearted sins, but if you do that in the way that she did, it doesn't group them in the same grouping as the order that I just suggested. Some people have thought that by looking at it in that order, you're saying that pride is the most serious of the sins, and that a lust is the least serious.
Right.
And that's actually very oversimplifying the way the order was formed and the way early Christians, particularly Pope Gregory the Great, did a lot of work on this concept, understood them. I think the strategic positioning of the first and the last and the middle is more interesting. That sloth is the failure of to love that which deserves our love, and it's the middle. It sort of stands between the colder sins and then the more bodily sins of the spirit are sort of the more the colder ones at the beginning, and then the sins more related to the body are the last three. But the lust that is put in last position is not just about sexual lust, but it's predatoriness. It's the consuming of other people for your own appetites, and the way it's described in Dante as the very last step before going into the presence of God and entering heaven is that it's passing through fire at the end. And so Dante puts the beatitude, he uses beatitudes for each of the sins and each of the levels of the mountain of purgatory. But the last one is, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And so the opposite virtue to lust is not virginity, it is chastity. And chastity doesn't mean the absence of sexual relationship, but it means holiness and chasteness in all your relationships. And so chastity was defined by Charles Williams as the love of the soul for God. And so that sort of suggests the importance of lust being the last of the seven. But pride is certainly a key, and some of the early ordering of the sins put pride as the root of the tree and all the others branching out from it. And one of the things that happens to Dante as he goes up the mountain of purgatory is that the mark in his forehead, which represents each of the sins, he has 7 marks placed in his forehead. When they're removed, he goes on to the next level. But when the first one is removed, the one representing pride, as he's been purged of pride, the going gets much easier. And it's explained to him, yes, this is the case once pride is removed. And I found myself thinking about that a lot. In any situation where you're troubled deeply and things don't seem right and you're struggling with negative feelings, to look at it and say, where is the pride in this? Is pride a key ingredient of why I'm feeling as bad as I do? And I feel like that is so helpful to realize. If you could just remove pride from your feelings and face your pride and deal with it and pray for and practice humility, it does make such a difference to coping with anything that's severely troubling. So It was good for the soul, I think, to meditate on this.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, sounds like it. Well, and I think also, as I'm kind of looking at the list that you cited earlier, like pride, like I'm looking at anger and envy in particular, and how much those are associated with pride. Like my anger, you can't have a decent anger, but not as it relates to pride. I don't think. It's one of the reasons Jesus did get angry in the temple, but like his pride wasn't mixed in.
Yes.
With it, and the same with envy.
Right.
And I think that what you said about the predatory lust and how Dante dealt with it and Sayers dealt with it reminded me of a passage in your book. I don't have the page number in front of me, but you mentioned that for Peter Wimsey, that lust is a problem, that Wimsey and possibly through Sayers, that you're really being lustful or immoral, sexually immoral, when you're working outside the bounds of honor.
Yes.
And this does, this, I might quibble with Sayers a little bit on this, but still, like, that she dealt with, it wasn't, the marital bond is a sacrament. I think she take that seriously, but, that's how she kind of like, Wimsey doesn't stay within the marital bonds before he meets Harriet. But he does stay within the bounds of honor.
Right.
As far as how he respects women and he's not a predator.
Yes.
In that respect. Yeah, so a great shout out to Charles Williams there, by the way. It's a good structure, good quote from him. So on the book itself, the 7 Deadly Sins is laid out roughly after a really great introduction to what the 7 Deadly Sins are and their history. You go roughly chronologically. I say very roughly chronologically because of the poetry, but you start out with some of her poetry and then kind of move on to her novels and plays and nonfiction, as far as how these things are reflected in her work. So I thought we'd go ahead. You can speak to the poetry if you want to, but I want to kind of end this little segment here on talking about the novels and how the 7 Deadly Sins are reflected in the novels, or especially if there's one novel you'd really love to talk about, that'd be great too.
Yes, well, I found it valuable that Sayers' works tended to fall chronologically anyway. So her earliest period was her poetry, although she did write some poetry later in life, but she was focusing on poetry in the first few years after she finished at Oxford. And then she focused on writing novels from like 1922 to about 1938. And then she began writing, well, in two genres, the Christian plays and the Christian nonfiction. And so from like 1940 on till her death. Well, actually, not so much after the mid 50s. From the mid 50s, from the early 50s on to the mid 50s when she died, she was working on Dante. So she really did. Only when she was doing nonfiction and church drama was she kind of working on both at the same time. Other than that, the emphasis was on one genre. So that made it easy for me to write the book somewhat chronologically, because there was an emphasis on one particular genre each stage of her life. It's easy to see, without having done much deep thinking or research, how the 7 Deadly Sins concept would be able to be applied to anybody's mystery stories and anybody's whodunit, because you're always thinking of the motive. Quite often the things that have to be figured out to solve the mystery are like means, opportunity, motive, and so to try to solve the puzzle, knowing what the motive might have been or could have been, or finally revealing what the motive was, is a big part of solving a mystery puzzle.
Right.
The plot is like a puzzle in a typical whodunit. So motive, of course, is a motive of sinfulness, and there can be a combination of reasons why someone commits a murder. Who profits, of course, suggests the motive of avarice. So in so many of her early novels, the emphasis on motive, and actually sometimes the understanding of the motive, only comes after the villain is revealed at the end. But as her novels went on, she did more with the depth of characters. Right from the beginning, she wanted to have well-developed characters in her books, unlike some mystery stories that just don't do much character development. She spoke when she wrote about the craft of detective fiction, which she did actually write a number of times about. She spoke about the competent delineation of character as a goal that she had and that she felt all detective fiction writers should have. And so then, of course, the villain's motives are something that become important in the plot. But she also was looking at the inner moral struggles of the good characters. And this became more and more important. And in the later novels, she aimed at what she called, quote, the serious treatment of the sins and passions, unquote. And so she didn't just mean the sins and passions of the most evil people in the novel, but also the sins and passions of ordinary people who were predominantly good. And so one of her main goals as a writer of fiction, and she wasn't particularly thinking in Christian terms in these years for complex reasons that I won't even try to begin to talk about now, but she was concerned that the genre of detective fiction becomes serious literature and be constructed to be more than just intellectual puzzles with a plot focus. So for that reason, she increasingly probed the inner lives of characters, and especially her main characters. And like Lord Peter Wimsey is a character which has a problem in that he's very prideful, but it's not a pride that is offensive to the reader for quite some time, because he's humorous and lighthearted, and it doesn't seem to be an offensive sort of characteristic. But as time goes on, and she introduces a love interest for him, she feels that she needs to make him a more humble person, a person who is more sensitive, more self-effacing, more genuinely contrite about the things that he has sometimes been flippant about in the past. And so as she did that, the novels became much more character-driven and theme-driven. And by the end of the last one that she wrote, Busman's Honeymoon, she had essentially written herself out of the genre. But it's still valuable to notice how much she did in making some of her later novels really good as novels, as well as being good mysteries, because from an English literature point of view, a whodunit is not actually considered a novel. It's considered to be
really
a lower level. The term novel would be used for a more serious work. So whodunits
I didn't know that.
are not novels. And so to be a true novel, it would have to have more than just plot interest. And so she wanted her detective fiction to become true novels, and I think she succeeds that in the last 4 or 5 novels. But the one that I found it really interesting, and it's often called the most loved of Sayers novels, is The Nine Tailors. And as I began to want to write about that, I came up against a huge problem, because there's hardly any obvious sinfulness going on. The corpse is found, but it's a long while before we get to know what the murderer was, who instigated the murder, what the means of murder was. And it turns out that the sin that drove the person who instigated the murder was already over and contained before the time frame of the novel begins, and we never encounter that person. And so it's like the evil is kept out of the novel, and I began to think, what am I going to do with this? And then I thought, it's a novel about virtue, about the godly virtues of ordinary people in this little village where the church is, where the bell ringing and the death of the person in the bell tower is all explored. And so it became a very joyous kind of an examination, because I wasn't focusing on the sins, but on the opposite virtues. And
that's nice.
And the main character in the novel, other than Peter Wimsey himself, is a clergyman called Reverend Venables. And apparently he was based on Sayre's own father, who was a clergyman, which is very, very sweet to think that that's what she did. And he's one of the most fascinating, well, fascinating is probably not a good word. I think he's one of the most endearing characters she has created. And someone has said, it's so much easier to create a bad character that's interesting than to create a good character that's interesting. But she really had created an interesting, good character when she created Reverend Venables. And the fact that she was remembering her own father and putting a lot of him into it probably contributes to that. But then the other novel that I felt I could appreciate with far more depth when I began trying to look at it through the grid of the 7 deadly sins is the last one, Busman's Honeymoon. It's not the most well-constructed of her novels, I would say, in terms of just the shape overall, but it really is a magnificent work. And it is, again, focused more on the virtues required for a strong and healthy marriage, as Harry and Peter are newly married and are learning what it means to consider each other and to cope with challenges as husband and wife. And just using the epigraphs that she has at the beginning of each chapter as keys to what she's doing in each chapter was very fascinating to me. And I started to think of it not so much as just an enjoyable story because of it is an interesting mystery and enjoyable because of just the atmosphere and the entertaining characters she has, but enjoyable because of the way she is systematically showing the challenges to being married. To married love. And so romantic stories usually end when they're about
with a marriage.
Married. But here you have romance within the marriage and showing what a mature person's attitude should be within a marriage. And so that was just a beautiful experience for me to be able to get inside that book and look at it from that perspective. And it was the last of her Wimsey books, but I think she did a lot with Peter and with Harriet, and she reached a point of concluding what she could do with them in that genre, and that was why she moved on to other kinds of writing after that.
Well, and I think too with Busman's Honeymoon, as you were speaking, I was thinking of, marriage in the early days for their marriage, and Peter goes from being excited by a case, like early on in the books, like excited about, okay, we've got a corpse, let's deal with it. He kind of grows into his distaste of the crime and the kind of the invasion of evil. And I think you really see that in Busman's Honeymoon, that, here they are trying to celebrate, and evil is it's a distasteful invasion. It's not something that's fascinating or cool. It's just really unfortunate and unpleasant.
Yes.
And I think that possibly leads to her, she's not alone in this, obviously, but her appreciation of Dante's Satan. There's nothing cool about Dante's Satan. Like, he's trapped in a pit of ice. He's ravenous. He's ugly. And that kind of like evil is just, it's just not pleasant. It's not cool or fascinating. It's just, irrational and ugly. Right.
And Lord Peter Wimsey is ceasing to find the solving of crime fun. He found it fun. Now Sayers, to be fair, actually introduced conscience and sensitivity to Peter Wimsey very, very early on. Going back through the early novels, I realized that she had put that there, a kind of a thread of kindness and compassion that would spring up at times even for very bad people. But by this last novel, she has created in him so much concern for the fact that he's sending a man to the gallows who well deserves it, but so much concern for the fact that this man was very poor and he himself has had a very rich life. And what part does poverty and deprivation and failure to have a good role model and encouraging things happen to your early life, what part does that play in creating a criminal? And so Peter Wimsey becomes so sensitive to this and so aware of it that he has ceased to be a jolly detective like he was through most of the early books. And so it's a natural outcome of Sayre's increasingly Christian focus as she tries to make her novels morally sensitive and morally insightful. And I think that she herself, by the time the war broke out, which is a few years after the end of her novel writing, had herself sort of reclaimed Christianity and its importance in her life, and then began to write Christian plays and Christian articles. But she didn't write directly on the 7 Deadly Sins until after she had written the novels.
Right, the essay, right? Is that what you're thinking of, the other 6 deadly sins?
Yes. And of course, she wrote a lot on the 7 Deadly Sins when she wrote on Dante.
Sure. So we're going to leave that there for right now. Come back for part 2 to hear Dr. Brown discuss sloth, Sayre's article, The Other 6 Deadly Sins, and then the 7 Deadly Sins in Sayre's plays. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions, please email me at DorothyLSayersPodcast@gmail.com. God bless you.